The stars were silent, watching the void where Earth once thrived. 3,000 years had passed since its destruction, but its memory still burned within the hearts of the few who had survived. Among them was Captain Arden Vox, the leader of the fleet that now drifted toward the crumbled remains of the blue planet. Her ship, Aquila, was one of the few to escape the cataclysm, the devastating event that obliterated their home. They had been warned, but no one had listened. The price of ignorance had been too high. Captain Vox stood at the bridge of the Aquila, staring at the holographic display in front of her. The remnants of Earth's shattered atmosphere flickered like a dying flame. For years, they'd told themselves that revenge was a hollow goal, that it was the pursuit of hope, not vengeance, that mattered. But now, looking at the destruction, the survivors had only one mission left: to avenge what was taken from them. "We're approaching the coordinates," said Lieutenant Mara Kane, her voice breaking through Vox's reverie. Vox nodded, eyes fixed on the image of Earth's devastated remains. She couldn't hide the anger that rippled through her. The people who had destroyed Earth, an alien race known as the Ither, had been nothing short of merciless. They had come to Earth under the guise of diplomacy, of peace, but they had ended it all with a single devastating strike. The Aquila was one of the few ships to make it off-planet before Earth's destruction. The majority of humanity had been lost in the cataclysm, the Ither's weapon of mass annihilation. There were only a handful of survivors left, scattered across the galaxy. But they had rebuilt, and now they were coming for retribution. "Prepare the fleet," Vox ordered, her voice cold. "We make no mistakes this time." The tension was palpable, the hum of the engines filling the silence that had fallen over the crew. The mood in the command center was grim. After all this time, this would be their final reckoning. There was no room for failure. Vox's mind raced with the events that had led them here. She had once been a part of the Council of Earth, one of the highest-ranking officials. She had worked with the Ither, believed in their peaceful overtures, their promises of partnership. But all of that had been shattered when their true intentions came to light. The Ither were not interested in peace. They were conquerors, and humanity was nothing but an obstacle. As the Aquila neared the remains of Earth, Vox saw it, the destroyed remains of their home, the once vibrant planet now little more than a broken shell, scattered debris orbiting what used to be an ecosystem. The once blue oceans were now mere dark patches, the continents half missing or split into jagged edges. Nothing remained of the cities where billions had lived, loved, and died. Only ruins. "Status report," Vox barked, turning sharply to her crew. "Energy levels stable," Lieutenant Kane replied. "Weapons are ready for deployment. All systems are at full operational capacity." "Good," Vox said, her voice steady. "Let's end this." The fleet moved in closer, a vast armada of ships led by the Aquila. This was not just a mission of vengeance, it was a battle for the survival of what remained of humanity. The fleet wasn't just here to destroy, they were here to reclaim their honor, to make sure that Earth's destruction would never be forgotten. But as they approached the center of the shattered Earth, something unexpected happened. The holographic display flickered, and a new ship appeared on the screens, a massive, sleek vessel, alien in design but unmistakably Ither in origin. It was unlike anything the humans had ever encountered before. It was a dreadnought, but one that seemed alive. The ship pulsed with an eerie energy that sent chills down Vox's spine. "What is that?" Kane whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Vox's heart raced. This was not a simple warship, it was something far more advanced, something that had never been seen before. "We've never seen anything like it," Kane said, eyes glued to the readouts. It's emitting a strange energy signature." The ship's appearance was no coincidence. They had known the Ither would be prepared for their return, but they hadn't expected a vessel like this. Vox's mind spun as the implications of this new development settled in. The Ither were not just planning to defend themselves, they were planning to finish what they had started. "Commander!" Lieutenant Kane shouted, pointing at the screen. "It's opening a rift. It's creating a portal." A sudden and violent surge of energy rippled through space, distorting the fabric of reality. The alien ship fired a beam of concentrated energy, and the rift began to grow. It was as if the universe itself was being torn open. The rift expanded, pulling in everything in its vicinity, meteors, debris, the remains of Earth itself, and turning them into a swirling vortex of destruction. "We're being pulled in," Kane shouted. The Aquila lurched violently as it was dragged toward the rift, the crew members scrambling to secure themselves. Vox gripped the control panel, her knuckles turning white as the ship's hull groaned under the force. The energy signature of the rift was unlike anything they had encountered before. It was as though time and space were collapsing into one singularity. "Shut down the engines," Vox ordered, trying to maintain control. "All power to the shields." But it was too late. The rift expanded faster than anyone could react. The entire fleet was being pulled in, their ships buckling under the pressure. The Ither ship continued to pulse with energy, a dark, malevolent force that tore through the fabric of space itself. "Hold on," Vox shouted, her voice barely audible over the roar of the rift's pull. The Aquila was sucked into the heart of the vortex, and in an instant, everything went black. When the darkness receded, Vox found herself staring at a sight unlike anything she had ever seen before. The Aquila had crashed onto a strange, desolate planet, a world completely alien to them. The sky was red, the air thick with the smell of sulfur. The surface was cracked and barren, a wasteland stretching out in every direction. But that wasn't the most shocking part. The rift was gone. The fleet was gone. Vox was alone. Her heart pounded in her chest as she scrambled to her feet. The crash had thrown her against the command chair, but she was alive. She reached for her communicator, but the device was damaged, the display flickering and malfunctioning. She was cut off from the rest of her crew, isolated in a hostile environment. Vox's mind raced. Where were the others? What happened to the fleet? And, most importantly, what had the Ither done to them? Before she could gather her thoughts, a low rumble shook the ground beneath her. It was distant, but growing louder. Something was coming. She wasn't alone on this forsaken world. A figure emerged from the dust. A shape, humanoid but twisted, its form partially obscured by the red haze. Vox's hand instinctively went to the weapon at her side, but it felt heavy, foreign. It was a weapon meant for battle, but now, it felt like the tool of desperation. The figure drew closer, and Vox's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just one figure, it was an army. The Ither. They had followed her, brought her to this place, and they were about to finish what they had started. Vox tightened her grip on the weapon. She wasn't going to die here. Not like this. Not without a fight. Vox's mind raced as the dark, humanoid figures of the Ither advanced toward her. The terrain was rocky, cracked, and covered in a fine, ash-like dust that shifted under their feet. She could hear the clank of their armored exoskeletons, the whir of their energy weapons charging, and the eerie silence of their movements. There was no hesitation in their steps, no fear. They were predators, and Vox was their prey. She drew her sidearm, her fingers moving with precision as she activated the weapon. A blue energy pulse crackled to life, illuminating the darkness of the desolate world. The Ither didn't flinch. Instead, they began to form a circle around her, closing in. "Come on, you bastards," Vox muttered under her breath, her grip tightening on the weapon. The first shot rang out, a streak of blue light that shot across the barren landscape. The Ither leader, the one at the front, raised its arm and deflected the blast with a shield made of pure energy. The pulse ricocheted and struck a rock, sending fragments flying into the air. Vox barely had time to react before the Ither fired back. She dove to the side, rolling across the cracked ground as another pulse shot past her. Her breath was heavy, her heart pounding in her chest, but she couldn't afford to panic. Her crew, her fleet, her people, were depending on her. As she scrambled to her feet, she saw that the Ither were closing in. There were too many of them, far too many to take on alone. Vox's pulse quickened as she assessed the situation, her mind calculating escape routes, potential advantages, and weaknesses. But then, as she looked around, she realized something terrifying: there was no escape. The Ither weren't just here to kill her, they were here to capture her. A high-pitched sound split the air, and before she could react, an energy net shot out from one of the Ither's weapons, wrapping around her body in a moment of excruciating force. The electric currents surged through her limbs, locking her in place, paralyzing her. Vox gritted her teeth, fighting the overwhelming pressure as her body locked in place. Her weapon fell from her hand, sliding across the ground, just out of reach. The leader of the Itha stepped forward, its alien eyes glowing with an unnatural intensity. It towered over her, its elongated body exuding an aura of power and control. "You were foolish to come here," the leader said, its voice a guttural growl that reverberated through the air. "We allowed you to escape once, but you are now nothing more than an insect beneath our boot." Vox spat on the ground, her vision blurred by the electrical surge still coursing through her body. "I'll never be your prisoner." The Itha's cold, alien gaze shifted. "You will be. All of you will. This world, this dimension, is ours now." Vox's mind raced. She had to buy time. She couldn't let them win, not when they were so close to finally avenging the destruction of Earth. Her fingers twitched as she silently searched for anything that might help. She noticed a faint crack in the rocky surface beneath her, a tiny seam that wasn't visible before. A plan formed in her mind, a desperate, reckless plan. But first, she needed to survive. Her body trembled, and the Itha leader leaned closer, its breathing heavy, its weapon ready to fire. Vox had only moments. She turned her head, trying to glance at her communicator. It was useless, destroyed in the crash. But the broken piece of equipment had given her an idea. In one fluid motion, she reached for the small piece of debris lying at her side. Her fingers brushed the jagged edges of the broken comm unit. Her heart skipped a beat as she activated the microchip inside, her eyes narrowing. A bright flash of energy exploded from the device, temporarily blinding the Itha soldiers. The electrical surge coursed through their network, frying their shields and weapons. Vox seized the moment, her body reacting instinctively. With a burst of strength, she broke free from the net, slamming her fist into the ground, pushing herself up in a single motion. The Itha stumbled, disoriented by the unexpected electrical pulse. It was enough time for her to grab her weapon, raising it to fire once more. She didn't hesitate. The blue energy pulse shot through the air, striking the nearest Itha soldier square in the chest. The alien let out a high-pitched screech as it crumpled to the ground. Vox didn't stop. She fired again and again, each shot finding its mark. The Itha soldiers fell, their armored bodies collapsing in a heap of lifeless metal. But there were too many. More were arriving from the surrounding rocks, their dark forms emerging from the shadows like a swarm. Vox's breath came in ragged gasps, and her energy was beginning to wane. Her weapon's power cells were draining fast. She needed to escape, needed to find a way to turn the tide before they overwhelmed her. The Itha leader raised its hand, sending a signal to its remaining soldiers. They regrouped, forming a tight perimeter around her, slowly inching forward. "This is futile," the leader said, its voice deep and resonant. "You cannot defeat us. This is our domain." Vox's eyes scanned the area, calculating her options. The rift was still there, somewhere deep within the shattered landscape. She couldn't just fight her way out, she needed to find it, harness its power. If she could reach the rift, she could destabilize it, use it to her advantage. But it would be a one-way trip. The Itha were relentless, but so was she. As the Itha leader moved forward, its clawed hand raised, ready to strike, Vox made her move. With a desperate cry, she lunged, diving beneath the alien leader's reach. The Itha swung its energy weapon at her, but she dodged, rolling across the ground. She scrambled to her feet and sprinted toward the rocky outcrop, heading in the direction of the rift. She could feel the ground tremble beneath her feet as the Itha soldiers pursued her. A pulse of energy exploded from behind her, singing the air, and she ducked just in time to avoid the blast. Her heart pounded in her chest as she pushed her body beyond its limits. She had no choice but to outrun them, outrun death itself. Ahead, the rift loomed, a swirling vortex of energy that threatened to consume everything in its path. Vox didn't look back. She sprinted faster, the chaos of battle raging behind her. The Itha were close now, their weapons charging, their footsteps thundering through the landscape. With one final leap, Vox dove into the rift. The moment she crossed the threshold, everything around her shattered. Time and space bent and twisted, the very fabric of the universe unraveling around her. A sense of weightlessness overtook her, and for a moment, it felt like she was falling through eternity. Then, a blinding flash. A rush of cold. And silence. When Vox regained her senses, she found herself in an entirely new world. The rift had taken her to an alien dimension, one that was dark and foreboding. But she was no longer alone. Standing before her were the survivors of her fleet, scattered across this strange new world, waiting. But the danger wasn't over. The Ither had followed her, and this world, this dimension, might be their final battleground. Vox stumbled to her feet, the disorienting chaos of the rift still swirling in her mind. Her limbs felt weightless, as though gravity itself was playing a cruel trick on her. The air around her was thick and oppressive, filled with an alien hum that seemed to echo in her very bones. She looked around, eyes wide, scanning the strange landscape. The world she had entered was unlike anything she had ever seen before, an alien dimension with jagged, crystal-like spires towering over her, their edges glowing faintly with an eerie green hue. The sky above was a deep purple, cracked open in places like an old wound, and distant flashes of lightning illuminated the horizon, casting an unnatural glow over the terrain. She wasn't alone. Slowly, one by one, the members of her crew appeared, emerging from the vortex behind her. The first to step through was Commander Rook, his eyes narrowing as he took in the alien world around him. He wasted no time in assessing the situation, scanning the area for threats, his hand instinctively reaching for the sidearm at his hip. He was a seasoned soldier, used to battle, used to chaos, but even his stoic expression betrayed a flicker of unease. "Vox, where are we?" Rook's voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the weight of the unknown. "I don't know," Vox replied, her voice tight with the remnants of adrenaline. "But we can't stay here long. The Ither are right behind us." Her words hung in the air like a death sentence. The Ither. She had seen them close up, felt their chilling presence as they surrounded her on that barren world. She knew they wouldn't stop. Not until they had her. Not until they had all of them. "We need to move," Vox urged, her voice cutting through the tension. "The rift might have thrown us somewhere, but it's not safe here. We have to find a way to fight back." The crew members nodded grimly, their resolve hardening. They had been through worse. They had survived the destruction of Earth, watched as the flames consumed their home, their families, their civilization, and now, they had returned. But this world was unlike anything they had imagined. The energy pulsing through the air felt different. Darker. Like the planet itself was alive, watching, waiting. They quickly regrouped, moving cautiously through the jagged terrain. Vox's thoughts raced. The rift had been their only hope, an escape from the Ither, a chance to regroup and plan their next move. But now they had been transported to a hostile world, a place where survival seemed almost impossible. The ground beneath their feet seemed to vibrate, as though the very fabric of the world was unstable, constantly shifting. It was as though the world itself was alive, a sentient being that was fully aware of their presence. Suddenly, a distant rumble echoed through the air. Vox froze, her hand instinctively going to her weapon. She exchanged a look with Rook, and he gave a curt nod. The rest of the crew fanned out, weapons at the ready. "What the hell was that?" one of the soldiers whispered, his voice filled with dread. Before anyone could respond, a shadow passed over them. The air seemed to freeze, and an overwhelming sense of dread filled the space. From the shadows of the crystal spires, a massive shape emerged. Vox's heart skipped a beat as she tried to make sense of the figure. It was like a creature born from the nightmares of 1,000 worlds, a hulking, insectoid monstrosity, its body covered in iridescent armor that shimmered with an otherworldly glow. Its eyes were black as pits, voids of nothingness that seemed to suck in the light around them. "Fall back!" Vox shouted, but it was too late. The creature let out a blood-curdling screech that echoed across the landscape, sending vibrations through the ground. It was massive, easily 20 feet tall, its limbs long and spindly, its claws glinting with an unnatural sheen. With a terrifying speed, it lunged toward them, its jaws snapping open, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. The crew scattered, but the creature was faster. It struck out with one of its clawed arms, swiping through the air like a scythe. The soldier closest to it was caught, thrown backward with bone-crushing force. His body hit the ground with a sickening thud, his form crumpling like a ragdoll. "Cover fire!" Rook barked, raising his weapon and firing a concentrated burst of energy toward the creature. The pulse hit its armored body, but it barely flinched. It continued its assault, the sound of its screeches piercing the air. Vox's heart raced as she fired at the creature, her shots hitting its armor with no visible effect. The creature was too powerful, too fast. They couldn't outgun it, and they couldn't outrun it. It was relentless. "Get back to the rift!" Vox yelled, her voice filled with urgency. She knew they had to escape, or they would all die here, on this alien world. But as she turned to lead the crew back toward the rift, she saw something that made her blood run cold. From the shadows of the crystal spires, more figures were emerging, more of the creatures, each more terrifying than the last. They were everywhere, surrounding them on all sides. The rift, their only hope of escape, was now out of reach. The first creature lunged again, its jaws snapping, and Vox barely managed to dodge to the side. She fired a point-blank shot, the energy pulse striking its leg. The creature hissed in pain but didn't stop. It swung its claws, knocking her weapon from her hand and sending her sprawling to the ground. "Vox!" Rook shouted, rushing to her side, but the creature was already closing in. Without thinking, Vox reached for her knife, a short, serrated blade she kept on her belt, and thrust it into the creature's exposed throat. The monster let out a low growl, its body twitching violently before it collapsed to the ground with a wet thud. Vox scrambled back, panting, her heart hammering in her chest. But victory was short-lived. From above, a massive explosion split the air. A rippling wave of energy surged outward, knocking everyone to the ground. Vox's vision blurred, and she struggled to breathe as the shockwave hit her. Her ears rang, and the ground beneath her shifted violently, as if the world was being torn apart. As she fought to regain her footing, she saw what had caused the explosion. High above, in the dark sky, the Ither fleet had arrived. Dozens of ships descended from the atmosphere, their massive forms cutting through the air with terrifying speed. They were here, and they were prepared to finish what they had started. "We don't have much time," Rook said, his voice strained. "We need to make a stand, now." Vox nodded, her mind racing. The odds were stacked against them. But they had come this far. They had survived Earth's destruction. They weren't going to die here. Not like this. "We fight," she said, her voice steady with newfound determination. The battle was just beginning. As the Ither descended and the alien creatures closed in, Vox and her crew took their positions, ready to face whatever came next. This was their chance to turn the tide. This was their moment to avenge Earth. And they weren't going to waste it. The ground trembled beneath them. The Ither fleet loomed above, their presence a looming shadow in the dark sky. Vox's pulse quickened as she prepared for what was to come. The creatures, those abominations, continued to swarm, a relentless wave of terror and bloodlust. But in this moment of utter chaos, one thought burned through her mind. She would not die here. They would not die here. Earth had already fallen once. It wouldn't fall again. The night air vibrated with a terrible hum as the Ither ships continued to descend, their massive forms blotting out the alien stars. Vox could see their hulking shapes, jagged and armored, their sleek black surfaces reflecting the strange purple glow of the planet's sky. She clenched her fists, sweat trickling down her brow as the weight of the situation settled over her. The crew stood in formation, weapons aimed at the advancing wave of alien creatures, the remnants of their desperate charge slowly moving into place. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and burning crystal from the earlier explosion. The ground beneath them still trembled, unstable and shifting with the power of the rift that had transported them here. Vox's chest tightened as she realized that this world, this unknown realm, had a pulse of its own, a life force connected to the destruction of Earth and everything she and the crew had fought to protect. The Ither knew that, too. They had been waiting, watching, biding their time for a final strike. Vox raised her weapon, the plasma rifle humming to life in her grip. She scanned the horizon, Every inch of the twisted landscape burned into her memory. No retreat, she muttered to herself. No surrender. Stay sharp, Rook's voice cut through the air, calm and focused. They're almost here. Vox nodded, her eyes scanning the darkness. The creatures were closing in, dozens of them, maybe more, each one an abomination of nature, their glowing eyes like molten pits, their bodies twisted and unnatural. She had seen them before, back on Earth, but this time, they were different. They were stronger, more vicious, and they had the support of the Ither fleet above. But Vox was ready. She lifted her rifle and fired. The energy bolt streaked across the air, hitting one of the monstrous creatures square in the chest. It screeched, its body twitching violently before collapsing, its armored carapace cracking under the force of the shot. She didn't hesitate. Another shot, and another. Each one found its mark, but there were too many. The creatures were relentless, moving faster than anything she had ever encountered. Rook was at her side, cutting through the alien horde with expert precision. His gunfire was controlled, focused, as he picked off targets with deadly accuracy. Yet, no matter how many they killed, more seemed to replace them, emerging from the jagged spires, pouring out from the shadows. We need to create a perimeter, Vox shouted over the cacophony of gunfire and alien screeches. If we don't stop the reinforcements, they'll keep coming. Rook nodded. On it. He barked orders, and the crew moved quickly, falling into place as they formed a defensive line. The ground cracked open beneath them, strange geysers of molten energy shooting up from the depths of the planet. The world itself seemed to be reacting to the invasion, and Vox could feel it. The energy in the air was building, surging with an intensity that matched the chaos unfolding. Vox could hear the Ither ships now, their engines roaring overhead as they passed. The ships were like giant shadows, their massive guns locked and loaded, poised for the destruction of everything that remained. "Commander, we can't hold them off much longer," one of the soldiers shouted, his voice trembling with fear. "They're everywhere." Vox didn't flinch. "We don't have to hold them off. We just have to survive long enough to get to the rift." The words were out of her mouth before she even thought about them. She knew it was a long shot. The rift had brought them here, and it was the only way back, but the closer the Ither ships came, the less likely it seemed they would survive long enough to get there. The ground shifted again, the planet seeming to tremble under the weight of the battle. It was then that Vox felt the pulse, the same energy surge she had felt when she first arrived. It wasn't just the creatures that were alive. The planet itself was responding, and now she realized the rift had something to do with it. The creatures weren't just biological entities, they were part of this world, an extension of its will. They were the guardians, and the Ither were their masters, controlling the dark energy that flowed beneath the surface. Suddenly, one of the Ither ships opened fire. A massive beam of energy shot down from the ship, cutting through the sky like a comet. It slammed into the ground 100 meters from their position, sending a shockwave through the air that knocked everyone off their feet. The blast cratered the earth, and the ground trembled as more of the alien creatures surged forward, emboldened by the arrival of their overlords. Vox pulled herself to her feet, heart racing. "We can't let them have the rift. We need to shut it down, now." Rook grabbed her arm, his face tight with urgency. "There's no time. We're too exposed here. We need a plan." She didn't have a plan. Not anymore. The truth was, there was no way out of this. The rift had brought them here, but it was also their prison. The Ither were closing in, the creatures were overwhelming them, and the energy was building to a point where it felt as though the entire world was about to collapse in on itself. "We fight," Vox said, her voice low but steady. "We fight until the end." Rook nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. His gaze hardened. "Let's give them hell." The crew spread out, each soldier moving with the precision of a trained fighter. Vox's eyes locked on the distant horizon, where the Ither ships loomed like the harbingers of death. She raised her rifle, firing into the chaos, the plasma bursts lighting up the night. It was a desperate gambit, a last stand, but it was all they had. Then, just as the creatures closed in, a new sound pierced the air. A crackling, electric hum, a voice. It wasn't human. It was a language beyond comprehension, a primal, guttural noise that made Vux's skin crawl. She whipped around, eyes wide, but it wasn't one of the creatures. It wasn't even one of the Ither. From the shadows of the crystal spires emerged another figure, a being unlike anything Vux had ever seen. It was humanoid, its skin pale and translucent, faint lines of energy coursing through it like veins. It moved with the grace of a predator, its eyes glowing a soft blue, radiating with a calm power. The alien spoke again, and Vux felt a strange tug in her chest, a recognition, an ancient understanding. The being's voice wasn't a command, but a plea, a request. The world paused. For a moment, nothing moved. The creatures hesitated, as if waiting for permission. The Ither ships above stopped firing. And then, in a voice that rippled through the air like a storm, the alien spoke. The rift is closing. You must leave. This world cannot be your salvation. The ground rumbled again, but this time, it wasn't from the battle. The rift began to pulse, its energy fluctuating as though it were dying. The planet itself seemed to resist them, pushing them away. Vux's heart stopped. No. We can't leave. We need to avenge Earth. The alien's eyes softened, but the power in its gaze was undeniable. Avenge, or perish. There is no escape from the cycle. And just like that, the Ither ships began to ascend, pulling back into the sky. The creatures retreated, their presence no longer a threat. The rift flickered one last time before it collapsed in on itself, leaving nothing but darkness. Vux stood there, breathing heavily, as the landscape around her slowly began to settle. The alien being turned, disappearing into the shadows. The fight was over. But the war had just begun.